Alrighty, everybody. So we're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome. I'm so excited to see such a full room today. This is amazing. I'm going to turn the camera in just a second once we introduce our guest speaker, so those ones you can also see. But happy Friday, everybody. And I hope you all have amazing plans for the Thanksgiving break next week. Because of Thanksgiving, we will not be here for Colloquium next week, but we will have our final Colloquium session on December 5th, and I would invite you all to come to that. At the end of today's session, I will reveal who the speakers and the topics will be. Today we have a very special guest speaker, and I would be remiss if I didn't thank both Jenny and Philip Axelman for getting the speaker here. They really did a lot of work in making sure that he would be available for us to get to listen to and to speak with today. I'm very grateful for that. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker. It is my pleasure to introduce Charlie Surbeck, a dedicated professional whose life and career reflects a deep commitment to service, compassion, and community. A native of Nowlands, gotta say it properly, and now a proud resident of Denham Springs, Charlie's roots run deep in Louisiana. He graduated from Brother Martin High School and continued his studies at Louisiana State University, and then went on to complete the funeral service curriculum at Delgado College. His journey in funeral service began in the year 2000, and for more than 2 decades, he has been a steady, caring presence for families in their most difficult moments. Charlie has built an impressive career working with some of the most respected funeral homes in the state. Throughout these roles, Charlie has served as a funeral director, embalmer, and crematory operator, roles that require not only technical skill, empathy, professionalism, and an unwavering dedication to honoring the lives of others. Today, Charlie is honored to serve the people of this area as a part of the church funeral services team. His experience, compassion, and calm presence make him a trusted guide for families navigating some of life's hardest moments. Charlie now makes his home in Denham Springs with his wife Whitney and their son Chase. His devotion to his family mirrors the same care and commitment he brings to his work every single day. Please join me in welcoming Charlie.
Thank y'all very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Let me turn the volume up a little bit. All right, can you say one more thing, Charlie?
Yes, ma'am. Are y'all okay in there? Can you hear me? Okay, great. I really appreciate y'all welcoming me in, and I'm gonna give a couple of disclaimers if you don't mind right before I start. You can probably already tell that I have a heavy New Orleans accent, which is part of just the nature of the place where I'm from. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to shake it. Now, here up in Baton Rouge, it's a little bit different, but people know me still from New Orleans directly. So, but we serve both areas right now. I'm at a place that it's called Church Funeral Services, as Miss Elizabeth mentioned, and we're another family-run funeral service that both buries and ritualizes, and of course cremates folks. And of course, I'm going to give a little bit of overview of things as far as I see them, as far as the funeral business is concerned. And then I'm going to give y'all an opportunity to ask any questions that y'all would like to. So the disclaimers are, I'd ask you understanding of my Yat accent, but also that I'm going to be as appropriate as I can with you as far as the answering of the questions. So as you demand of me more, I will be more frank with you, just so that this is an open-ended conversation and you can have all your questions answered. This is a really good opportunity for folks to have a conversation with a director when they're not in the position of needing the help of one, which sometimes can be taken advantage of. And in my career, I've been trying to reestablish relationships with families to be able to promote what we do, because I think it's an important part of our civilization and the way that we've progressed as humankind. So let me give a little overview of what we do and a little history of stuff, and then I'll get closer to me and the more modern stuff, and then we'll go to the questions, okay? Okay, the first part is an overview. You know, history of caring for the dead happens to be one of the most primary things in the history of our civilization. Those are the markers that anthropologists use to date when different milestones happened. And I know that that history sometimes is complicated, of course, with the new evidences that we find. But one of the first markers of our civility as human beings was the ceremonial burial of the dead. And that recollection is had in the even earliest of findings that we have of human existence. Of course, then over time, it became more of a religious appointed ritual. But those things were always to answer questions that people wanted to find out. Of course, when we're in a position of dealing with death, all there is questions because we don't have any answers. So what we really try to do is walk people through it, because you have to feel the grief and you have to be a part of that. And so as a part of feeling it, you have to explain it, and religion helps to do that, of course. And so as funeral directors, we learn about many different types of funeral services and how we best serve those religions. Originally, I mean, we learned about first that, in religious custom, it was a taboo thing to deal with the dead. So a lot of times funeral directors were outside of the area, or at that time, they weren't really called funeral directors. They were part of a caste system that was much lower than what your normal well-to-do people were, because to touch a dead body was something to make you unclean. And so it wasn't always, it was more like what an executioner would be than a doctor or a philosopher, even in that way. So people didn't want to really deal with the funeral director or the person that dealt with the dead until it was the time to do so. And even still now, I appreciate that, as far as my dealings with others, and trying to be sensitive to that too. But it's always trying to receive those people in a place where they are and serve them in that way. Back to the history of it, of course, we think about funeral service in the Egyptian realm, most formally and earliest on. I mean, they mummified the remains because, of course, the belief in the afterlife was very prominent. And that was a way for those to be able to attain the afterlife, to have their body and all their possessions to go along with them. And that, changed over time, but we still have some elements of that same idea now, though now more modernized. From there, you go to, like Viking funerals where they had ships they would set on fire with the corpse on it, set them out to sea and set them on fire by Arabs. Romans as well, but they started in burying. And then we get into, of course, the Christian times where, you had both Christian and Semitic religions going on in our Western cultures, where Semitic burials, like Jewish and Muslim, would have happened immediately because of probably the environment and things that they were in. Those traditions still exist now. But it's the Christian tradition that I was raised in. And if you don't know, in New Orleans, a lot of us are raised Catholic and in a Catholic environment, but also there's folks that are Catholic in a culture, but not necessarily in a religion. So there's a very like an open or recognized part of that spans in the history of New Orleans now. And really, that's what I was raised in. Growing up and all, and going to wakes and funerals and things. So I was really always enamored with the rituals that it took to go through these processes. And as a kid, I was real involved in the church, and so I was an altar boy in the Catholic church, and they would call us out from school to go and participate at the funerals and to help with burial of the dead. So even at an early age, that was something that I was interested in. But some get interested in for questions of death and why and how, but others get interested in it for the ritual circumstances and why do we do these things? They happen to do with our still not knowing what the future is, and what these unknowns are dealing with. We use ritual to go ahead with. And so I still continue that same thing through now. Of course, as the modern funeral developed, like what we see right now, it developed right after the Civil War and during the Civil War. And what happened then? Families were away from their homes for the first time in a long time. People had died away from home, and they needed a way to bring those people back to their homes. So a lot of Southern funeral directors or morticians at that time went into business to serve a lot of Union soldiers, because they were really the ones that had the money to send their bodies back. And so our funeral custom, as we know it now, really starts in the Civil War times. And what really a good example of that funeral tradition is Abraham Lincoln's funeral, and how he was so well embalmed that he was taken to train stops along the way between Washington and Springfield, Illinois, where he was end up being buried, where they would stop and have a viewing of his remains, and people would line up to see him, and in that, give honor to him as the leader that they had known, and to know all the different things that he was able to accomplish in his life. And then that extrapolated to other people who died in that same war, to be sent home. And so those with the means would contract directors in our areas here to go to the battlefields and to make ready for the shipment of those remains home, usually by train. And it required a new way of embalming that wasn't used in the past, because we really didn't know this technology or know what the body was like. There was a few people in this situation that ended up adding to that. There was a fellow named John Hunter and William Hunter. They were brothers. Dr. William Hunter really developed the first way of arterially embalming someone, which I'll get into in a second to tell you what that is. But that's our modern way of embalming. And that was followed by a fellow named Mikhail Buterov, who originally used the chemical formaldehyde for this reason. Okay, before formaldehyde, arsenic and mercury and other heavy metals were used to embalm bodies. But he developed a way to use formaldehyde, which is still quite dangerous to people. It's a definite proven carcinogen, but it is not to the effect of arsenic or mercury or anything else that would take the same effect on a body. Now, I'm going to get into that a little bit. The thing that I do is, of course, I have 3 different facets of my job. I'm an embalmer, I'm a funeral director, and I'm a crematorium operator. I'm an embalmer because I learned how to embalm in school, and I was licensed for that. And so I prepare the dead for a funeral. That is arterially done now. It's done by raising arteries and veins in specific points on the body and replacing the blood with a formaldehyde solution, mainly water, but then formaldehyde as well. And if you have any chemistry folks in the room or anybody in science, there is a reaction that formaldehyde makes with proteins that formalize them. So in decomposition, proteins break down, and they're built out of amino acids that connect in a polypeptide bond. Well, those bonds break down when normal decomposition happens. And we use a very synthetic way with this chemical to reestablish those bonds in an unnatural way to make the dead ready to be seen. Because, decomposition happens very quickly after death, depending on the situation and the environment of death. And so in those ways, we have to try to stop that from happening, at least for a time, that people can see the dead and they can have vigil with them, maybe the rituals of their religion and a proper burial. And so that became our tradition for a long period of time, even up into our postmodern times. I've been in the business 25 years, and where I started working, we still were having very traditional Catholic services as a majority of our services, and those would range definitely over 60% of the business, if not more. Nowadays, though, with the advent of cremation being popular and well accepted, the rates of cremation have far exceeded burial. And so now we're looking at 80 to 83% or so of people that pass are being cremated instead of buried. And so really people sometimes are losing out on the ability to have a gathering or a ritual, or even rethink that whole thing, because we never realized how close we were to our ancestors. But with people being so separate now, we don't have that indication. So people aren't always knowledgeable about who to call and what to do. And so they do the cheapest or the easiest thing. But in our tradition, we did these rituals not because we thought that they were easy, but because we thought we needed to walk through them. Because grief is a process that everybody has to go through, and it's not something you can just dismiss. It is a natural order of life that you have to go through the processes of in order to then get to another side of it where you can continue with life. Never replacing the person or the memory of them, but always holding them dear in your heart and continuing on to live without them is really the way that we counsel people, But I'm proud to be able to still make arrangements with families on a daily basis for these arrangements for either paperwork for cremation or for full burial arrangements. I conduct funerals on a daily basis when needed, of course, with visitations to begin, and then the funeral service, and then the burial at the cemetery. And my job involves the logistics of all of that. So when you have a death in the family, you call a funeral director, and he or she takes care of those things all locally for you. It's still one of the old time businesses that still gives a personal care and service to folks. And so I'm really proud of being able to speak about it and being able to answer your questions, because I think the most important part now is to have communication with your loved ones and have a talk about your family's traditions and how that it is that you want it to be cared for, not to focus on it, but more to address it, to embrace it, and to let it go. It's so many people that want to ignore the fact that are really in a situation where they have to deal with a lot of grief at the time when they have a loss. So, that's a basic overview of kind of what we do and how we do it and things. I was hitting on a lot of different points and things, but I hope you got a good little overview of what we do. Okay, and now I want to open it up basically to y'all and see what kind of questions that you have and how I can answer them to the best of my ability. Yes, ma'am. Go ahead. Oh, and pardon my pronouns. I say pronouns automatically from my dealings with folks, but I apologize if I call out wrong or anything. Okay, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay.
Hello.
Hi. I was wondering, how do you balance your exposure with death with like your regular life with your family and all that? Does it ever bleed over?
Yes, ma'am. It certainly does. And in fact, in my life, it's even more so because my wife is a funeral director too. We met in the business. So a lot of what we go through in a day comes home. And we tried to make a rule early on that we wouldn't talk about work at home, but it certainly does affect everything that we do. And so we try to talk about it a little bit and kind of debrief on it, because she's doing the exact same thing that I'm doing in another office of our company. And it helps really to talk about it and to go through it. Now, what I really am always at odds with, and this is just a strange thing that I've realized over time, is that the main population of people have a naivete about death, right? I mean, it's kind of like it's part of our upbringing. We want to know as much as we can, but then we don't want to know too much, and that naivete causes people to not embrace this situation. And so I kind of feel like I've lost that a little bit, but maybe I've gained a way to deal with it better. But I can't say that I'm not going to grieve at the time when I need to. I think it's important, and you really need to. So it's affected my personal life. And my son went to funerals from the time he was a little baby. So, he was well established in that. And, none of us are really morbid or worried about death in that way. We're worried about the families and the people that we're serving and how we can make a better resolution to the things that they deal with. So we try not to take too much of that to heart and try to help the family as much as possible, So I hope I've answered your question.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Next. Okay, in the middle first.
Oh, okay, so I was curious to see whether or not there were any like specific requests that people may give to you in regards to preparation of the body and how you go ahead and go about that in regards to company policy, say. Like,
Yeah.
is there any specific protocols you have to go in regards to doing specific things with the body rather than like the normal routine?
Yes, most definitely. Well, you know that once a funeral home is involved, then the funeral home is going to be the one to have everyone to come to their place, or even if we go to a church, to have everyone to come there. But it was our work that we're showing. So there are lines that we won't cross as far as appropriateness sake to family satisfaction. Okay, so but it's always in an appropriate way, right? I've had people come with the weirdest and craziest requests of me at the time when they've died. And some I've been able to do, and some not so much. Okay. So, pardon me for being inappropriate, if at all. But some people tell you that they want to be buried on face first down so everybody can come and kiss their butt on the way out, right? Or, somebody wants to make a hand signal with their hands some kind of way, and they want that to be set into them. Well, that kind of stuff. I mean, you don't do that for the respect of death in general, okay? But we have had instances recently, and this has come from New Orleans as well as in South America, of the funeral home being more of a place where you go to talk about how you can display the body in a lifestyle or a still life, maybe if you want to call it, where the dead body is positioned in a way that looks like they're alive. So everybody can kind of see the still life of them. And if you look it up, it's happened a few times. And in New Orleans, there's been a few times where it was been like a socialite that died, and she was put on stage on a park bench with flowers all around her in her favorite dress, with a hat on her head and a cigarette in her hand, and with a big lapel pin that said bitch on it. Because that's just the way that she wanted to, right? She was just that kind of person. And in that way, it was a celebration of her life. And so I'm still at odds with, what is appropriate and what is not, but the lines are constantly being pushed in that way. But as far as we are concerned, we always kind of do things in a standardized way, so people kind of know what to expect when they come to a funeral, and that being people at a comfortable situation, not looking like they're uncomfortable in a little bed. That's our aim and goal. Not necessarily to make people look like they're alive. And that's one of the things that people sometimes don't always understand. Embalmers can do a really fine job and can make them look almost exactly like they're breathing in a casket. And you'll go up to them and see that. It's almost a part of what we are prepared to see. But we can't always do the most perfect job on everyone. The conditions of death, the situations, what we're given to begin with has to be dealt with in a certain way. And it's really, in the end, for the purposes of exposing the dead to the living so that they can have a tactile sensation that this person is passed, more than just the idea that they're dead. I think that by our senses and the way that we are, we need to have those different experiences of it to really know that it's happened and get over it. So yeah, I get requests all the time like that. Now, one I've done before, I had a request of a father of a friend of mine. Every time I saw him, he'd say, "You need to put a smile on my face. You know, put a smile on my face when I'm sitting in the casket." Now, we don't force smiles. We try to make it look like they're just, resting. A smile on a dead person's face looks creepy, totally creepy. I mean, like the Joker, but like creepy. And a real big frown on their face looks just as creepy. So, but for him, the only person that saw him was his wife and his son and me. And so I lifted the size of his cheek just ever so slightly to make him look like he had a little grin on his face. And that made the wife so happy. And I don't think that would have been inappropriate anyway, even if the public would have seen him like that. But everything is gauging, appropriateness, I guess it is. Yeah. Thank you for the question. Next gentleman in the back.
Yeah, so you
Oh,
had,
man.
it's okay. You had mentioned cremation versus embalming. Have you noticed that choosing cremation over embalming somehow limits people's ability to go through the grieving process?
Certainly. Yes, ma'am. Definitely. Or yes, sir. It's about really the experience of death, as we always had, right? I think that our natural experience of death has to do with the reality that this exists and that we're a part of it. And the more that we separate ourselves from the rituals that have been provided for us, or at least, inculcated in us in that way, then that experience is lessened in a way. Now, it does provide for a time where families don't have to go through the viewing of remains and that kind of thing, but sometimes it takes away from what could have been. You think about families when you give an opportunity for people to come and pay their respects. Even if 10 people come, that's 10 more people than you thought were going to come. And if you have a church full of people in the end, wow, that's an awesome thing. Now, you can do that with cremation just the same. But, the reality of having the body present and in a situation where we can see them is another reality to us that we cannot deny. And I think that has to harken back to our most basic selves, and our dealings with nature as it is. And in dealing with nature, we have to deal with some things that are beyond what our control is. And then we have to find some kind of way to make that all a part of a regular life and a regular plan. But you can never do that. So it's part of our humanity. So I encourage you to embrace it in as many ways as you can. But in the event that we have a cremation, I tell families, look, if you're going to have them directly cremated, have everybody come to the bedside right now before we come to bring them into our care. This is the time to see them. That's how we always did it back in the day. When this funeral custom continued on, my predecessors would go to people's houses and they would embalm people in their bedroom or in their bathroom. And then they would put them in their bed. And then only the family would see them. And then at some appointed time, they would take them and the funeral director would come back and put them in a box and they would put them in the front of the house so that the place where they normally receive people, everybody would come in and see them. And this was always done at the home. Now, it was funeral homes that came into being after a certain time, probably after the 1900s or so, or even before that. After the Civil War, definitely, where these conglomerations of people came together to serve people in a way. And then when they couldn't have the funerals at their own homes, then the funeral director would have a parlor that he would rent to them to have it like that it was their home. But the idea was always that it be a home atmosphere. And what I'm seeing nowadays, especially in what I'm able to do, is that some folks will want to have a home funeral as well. And I'm glad to be able to provide that to folks, just like we did back in the day. You know, you can still do that. There's nothing legally keeping you from doing that. So we provide that as well and offer it. We don't see too many people taking up on that offer, but it's important that we do. So as to keep it away from a certain institutionalized idea of everything. But getting back to the cremation idea, you know, if that's going to be our way of taking care of our loved ones, then we need to make sure that if we have a time that we can embrace their death, then we take that opportunity to. And so we go to the bedside and we see them. Even if it's hard to do so, we see them and we commune, we vigil with them for a moment or two or so with the family, you support them, and then you go about your business. But it's important to have that encounter. And so that's what I think people lose out on sometimes with cremation in that way. But it can be less creepy, certainly. I mean, you know, anything with a body to have to do with, it's going to be automatically kind of creepy, you know. So thank you.
I think we may have a question. Oh, no, we don't have a question in the chat. Okay. I was looking in the chat to see if we had any questions from our virtual audience. While they're thinking of some, does anybody else have any questions?
Do you think that the constant exposure to like, it's kind of morbid, but you know, lifeless bodies, do you think that affects your relationship with your own body and how you view yourself in other people's bodies? Because
Yes.
yeah,
Yes,
like,
definitely. You know, the care for everyone, in my estimation of it, is like I'm caring for my mother or my grandmother or someone, you know, someone that's close to me, because that is someone's grandmother or their mother. And so they need to be cared for and respected in that way. And so everything that we do has an utmost of respect, even behind the scenes, you know. You know, people are exposed at times, but then well covered at other times, you know, when we don't need to have them exposed. There are certain, you know, practical things we have to do, but always with the knowledge that this is a loved one, this is a respected person that needs to have our respect in that way, and further than just their decency, but you know, even just to respect it, they've lived a beautiful life and now they have a family that's caring for them. So that's what I'm doing for them, like they would be doing it themselves if they could, you know. But in my estimation of things, I don't think I want to be embalmed, tell you the truth. I embalm people all the time, but I don't think I want to be embalmed. I would rather that my family be attentive at my death, see me when I die, put me in a box, maybe pass me through the church if they want to, if it makes them feel better, and then put me in the ground somewhere, maybe even in a natural burial where, which is coming in vogue now too, where people aren't embalmed and they're buried in the most simple of casket that wouldn't even, I have one that I just came to my office the other day, doesn't have a metal piece on it. And so everything goes back to the ground in a way that it should. And that's how I want to be, I think. You know, I don't really need to have an extended time to be held or to be preserved for. You know, since this stuff came out of the Civil War, people had to be transported. It, like, embalming is something that preserves the body for a good amount of time, you know, or at least keeps it in a stable situation. So what I need, I think, is to be buried as soon as possible, you know, and for my family to be all there. But that doesn't always happen. You know, ideals are what we would like to happen. So say something happened where my son is overseas in the military or something, and I die. So I want to be immediately buried, but I also want my son to see that I'm dead and that I'm there, you know? So if my wife has to have me embalmed for my son to come home, it's just an understanding that has to be done. But I know the embalmer is going to be careful and nice with me and do the best job he can, or she can. It's just a matter of not needing it if I don't, you know what I'm saying? Um, I want to do more natural stuff. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
What is something that you wish that people knew before they enter your career?
Okay. It's difficult in not necessarily physical ways, but it can be. Okay. Recently, my employment, it changed really dynamics of it. When I first started in this business, I started in a prep room of all men. It was all men doing the work. And then we had a few ladies, but they were dealing with families directly and taking funerals out, but they were not embalming the dead. When my wife came in as an apprentice, she began to embalm, and there was another lady that was also there. And that began a steady movement toward what we have now, which is a majority of ladies doing the business and men that be there, you know, a lot of times to guide in the ways that we can, but in order to do the heavy lifting and the things that sometimes the ladies can't do in the ways that we can. So it's a little bit more well-rounded now. I feel that if you have a lot of times a female perspective on things, that I can do my job a lot better, because a lot of what I has to do with how a flower looks in a place or not in this place or in this place, or how clothes look on people or how they look, you know, in a casket and things. And you know, I can do a good enough job of that, but I need another pair of eyes looking at that too and saying, you know, that's good, or we need to do this a little better, or what have you, you know, that's always good. And so I see that as a benefit to our business now. It's just a little different, but you know, differences in people's, you know, upbringings and the ways that they've dealt with death all has to do with the way they deal with families and themselves. And seems like one thing I see more than often, more less, or more often than not, is that family or that people in the funeral business have had a death experience that then they take from and want to come into it because they were so you know, impressed by that experience, either in a good way or a bad way. So like my wife, she went into embalming. One of the things she loved the best was some of the incorrupt bodies that had been seen in the past, you know, like the Catholic Church keeps a lot of incorrupt people. I don't know if you've ever heard that, where they dig up saints after a period of time and their bodies are in a state of stability, like not decomposed, and then they expose those people to be seen as a part of um, worship or what have you. One of those is Saint Bernadette Subaru, and she's in Nevers, France, and she's exposed like that. Now she looks beautiful, but she has a wax mask over her face that was made by Madame Tussaud. So her body lays there dressed and ready like it is, skeletal probably, but her face is perfect looking, you know. And so those type of images cause people to really find, you know, all kinds of questions that has to do with our business, and then they find a place in it. So, and then really after it comes the benefit of being able to serve people. So that's where we really see the goodness of it. But I can't say that we don't talk about burning out all the time, because I don't think, in my estimation of this, that humans are supposed to deal with death as many times as what we're dealing with death, because we bring it in, you know. We can't just ignore it. If you ignore it, you're not a good funeral director. But if you take it too much in, you're not a good funeral director either. You got to be the third party. You got to be the person that walk people through. So I think that's where I have my proudest times, where we can do things beyond people's expectations and then satisfy them.
I have a quick question for you, Charlie.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about mortuary school, what it entails, kind of what the admission process is like, how you get into something like that?
Definitely, yes, ma'am. There's different places in the country that have schools. The one I went to is in Delgado. It's in New Orleans. It's a community college. I know in Florida there's a place close to y'all that does it too. I'm not familiar with the name. The program I went through was a 2-year program for an associate's degree in allied sciences with the focus in funeral services. And that's the specific degree that I have. But there are some full career, well, not full career, but full bachelor programs. I had a friend of mine that I worked with was from Southern Illinois University and went for a 4-year program there for funeral directing. But really, in the end, it's preparing you to take an international board test, which is administered by a general board that all of the state boards respond to or to take from. And after your curriculum, which is a 2 or 4-year program, you will have to take a test and then pass that test to the satisfaction of the board for you to receive your license. And in my state, there's a dual license that happens for funeral directors and embalmers. And that's the one that I got initially. There is an opportunity for people just to be funeral directors that don't have to really deal with the preparation of the remains. But usually you put yourself in a position that you'll be less paid than others that are there because you're not as well able to take care of everyone. So that kind of answers that question in that way. The admission standards are going to follow usually, the basic admission standards. It's not going to be over top, like a medical school or law school or anything will be. But I know each place tries to vet the people for what they expect and what they are to expect. You see what I'm saying? I mean, that's just kind of gauging people. And I think that funeral program is a good time to be able to, learn as much as you can and know whether you want to do that or not. If you can't see a dead person in person, like even how they're presented at a funeral, I don't suggest that you become a funeral director. I would suggest somebody that has a more of a leveled understanding of both the art side of things and the science side of things, and being able to put that together in a way to serve people. That's what I pride myself in. I liked both sides of things growing up, but was never better with one or the other. So this really kind of checked all the boxes for me in a career path.
Thank you.
So you talked a little bit about the embalming process. Could you talk a little bit about the crematory process?
Yes, cremation is something that has to be authorized by the next of kin. In our state, it has to be a majority of the next of kin. So I have to get signatures first. And then, we have parishes here instead of counties. So the parish has to be involved. So the coroner gives me a permit after the family meets me. And then I have the cremation performed. So in one of our locations, we have the place where it's done. It's called a retort, and it's like an incinerator that's meant for a casket or for a body, in that way. So it looked kind of like what a mausoleum crypt looks like, where it opens in the front and like a little square, and then it's can accommodate a casket in its length. Now, you don't have to be embalmed to be cremated. And that's one thing that people need to know. So if you don't want to be embalmed, that's another option. But you don't have to be embalmed to bury either. But once we get the official permits, and then we send the paperwork to the crematorium, my staff there, or me, depending on who's there, we'll take the person out of our cooling facility, which is part of a little refrigeration area. We properly identify them once again. We make sure that the family has any other request, like a lock of hair or a fingerprint or what have you. And then we place them into a container, which is a cardboard container that's used in lieu of a casket to place them into the retort itself. And you wait till it gets hot enough that it can really consume the body. It's about 1600 degrees. And it takes, depending on how warm the crematorium is, it can take an hour or two. With a really heavy person, it might take a little bit more. But once they're cremated, the remains are in varying degrees of solid parts, bones that are in pieces sometimes, but very brittle. And so that contents is all taken out every time. And then it's processed in a way that makes it a consistent product that you see when we release them to families. So that's why you see, when you look at it, it doesn't look too different, but when we originally remove them from the crematorium, it certainly does. It looks more like a person, or more recognizable to be, but skeletal in that way. And then once the remains are processed, then we receive them at our individual locations. It's more convenient for the families, and release them to them. So they bring us urns or any other receptacle, or they might buy one, but then we release them straight to the family, the next of kin. And that's it. In the back?
How often do you deal with families that might have conflicting requests as to what to do with?
Well, yeah, that does happen. The problems nowadays has to do with families that are separated, that have different will about them. But luckily in the law, I'm responsible to the next of kin. So really the only complication comes to me in that there are multiple next of kins then that I have to satisfy. And in that way, I satisfy them by usually piecemealing depending on how many that they are. So say a family comes in and both of the children of the deceased, and they have no spouse, signs to authorize their cremation. But one of those people refuses to sign unless that they get a portion of the remains. Okay. I've got to be kind of like King Solomon in that way. I've got to talk to the other person, see what their intentions were. And then if worse comes to worse, I give them half and half. It's the best I can do, or a portion thereof. Say if there's 5 of them, you give them a fifth of them if they cannot agree. But the most sought after is to have everyone to agree that they're all in one container, and then that container can be placed hopefully in a cemetery or some other place, but you can keep them at home too. But that tends to be a problem because families don't want to bury them, or they forget about them, or they're left in a house when they sell a house and somebody else finds them there. We have that occasion too sometimes. So the encouragement that I always give families is that, in dealing with this, that you feel the grief, number one, that you go through your own grief process. And in the end, you make some disposition of those remains in a place that you think is respectable and good for them. I don't think it's always healthy to bring them home and to have them on the mantelpiece or on a shelf or what have you. I don't think that completes the process that we really need to complete, and at the scene, when you're at a graveside, when you saw a casket being, lowered into a grave, there's hardly anything that we can say that would dismiss that as being a final evident moment. But cremation certainly doesn't give that same idea. So that's the other encouragement that I have, to find a place that you can make a disposition of these remains, even if it's scattering them or in the river or in the woods or what have you, but that they're not next to you all the time, because we really need to make steps further than this. Grief, we have to go through, is part of life, but we need to get over it too and move on. And without ever forgetting that person, they're going to leave a hole in us. They're not going to go without doing that. But that's the nature of life. That's the beauty of having this loving relationship with whoever it was, or all of these folk, that they will leave a place in them, in you, that only they can fill. And in that memory, though, you learn how to deal with that space. And then you use the love you learn from them to continue that love to others. So maybe that's the whole point of it all, you know? And that's what I hope that we're doing when we separate from people. Yes.
I've got two, and they're
Okay.
very different veins.
Uh-huh.
One, how do you go about balancing the different religious perspectives and helping them with the grieving process as a director? And then the other one, which is a little more lighthearted, what should we, in terms of our will and whatnot, as people, do to make your life easier as like an embalmer or crematorium operator? Like, what thing could we do to make your life just a little bit easier before we die?
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. So, with the first question, tell me again, repeat what you said.
Balancing religion,
Yes, okay.
how to grieve.
Right. Well, I think that that's the coolest part about this, okay? That I get to learn all of these details about other religions that I would have nothing to do with or no understanding of whatsoever. And all of their dealings with death in themselves are a lesson to us about how that people deal with death. It might not be the way that we want to, but it certainly is a established point in their families and in their lives. So it's the coolest thing to enact a different type of funeral every day. And, and then to see the variances even in those religions, because there are differences between, say, Vietnamese Buddhists and Chinese Buddhists, for example. And some things are very much acceptable and other things are not. With Muslims, there is a way to do it. And if the family don't do it, the temple will do it, the mosque will do it, because they believe that if one person goes without a Muslim burial, then they're all at fault for that as a community, So it's a very community-oriented type of way of dealing with the dead. But it's cool to see how they do. The Muslims will come to the funeral home and bathe the body, and we'll never embalm it. But they have to have their funeral like the next day. So that's some of the quickest things that we do to get that all lined up, and then they go to the mosque. And, I'm a Christian, so they take the body in the mosque and I just stand outside and I wait. But then they come back with it and it's all good, So it's really neat to be a part of all of these things when I can't necessarily be a part, but I can watch them and see what's going on and then understand how they dealt with that death. That's cool. Now, as opposed to what we talk about as making our jobs easier, our jobs are going to be easier if families have the conversations that I mentioned. If y'all talk to your loved ones and you embrace the fact that death is a part of life just as much as birth is, and that I know that that's the hardest thing to do sometimes, and it might put you through a little bit of a depressing time, but it's with that depression that you bring that to your family and you talk to your loved ones and your family about how they want to do things and how you want to do things. So you can have that conversation, and it can never be worried by the grief that it would take at the time when somebody was actually dead, or the time when somebody's actually dying, or the time when you have to make these decisions, because it's at that time that you don't always think through those decisions. And I would so much appreciate that people would know that before they came to me. But I'm very well equipped to give them all the information they need. It just creates another thing they have to go through at that time, which is hard. The gift of love to give to people is to put your wishes on file somewhere. Even if you just write them down in your own notes and you tell your family that this is what you want. But then more formally, you go to a funeral home and you make a pre-arrangement that would fund those funerals. That's like the next step, because then it's about the funding of it. But it's better to do it when you're young, then it's all taken care of and it's all done. And then the prices usually are guaranteed at that time, you know, when you take out pre-arrangements. It's different with different funeral homes, um, but it's always a good thing at least to have something in place, even if it's just life insurance that can be claimed for at the time of death, that can fund what you would want to have. Um, all of those things are good ways to make what we do a little bit easier on families. Perfect. Cool.
So I think we have time for one final question. Does
Oh, yeah.
anybody have a question you'd like to ask? No? Alrighty. Well, thank you again, Charlie. This was amazing. Y'all can join me in thanking him.
Y'all welcome. I wish I could come there to be with y'all in person. I really tried this morning. Unfortunately, cars don't always do what you want them to do. So I appreciate you being able to take me like this and for dealing with my yaddiness.
Oh, absolutely. We love it. So, thank you, thank you, thank you. We appreciate
right.
you so very much.
All right. Well, y'all take care. Okay. Good meeting y'all.
Good to meet you too. Thank you.
Bye.
So, for those of you here, for next time, again, we're not gonna meet next week. Y'all have a wonderful Thanksgiving with your friends, your family, your loved ones. And then December 5th will be our final colloquium. And it is going to be Michelle Jensen, who's gonna talk to us about forensic genetics. So, hi, Jenny. You're welcome to talk if you want to, Jenny. You're on mute, but.
I was just gonna say that I wanted to tell Charlie not to apologize for his New Orleans accent. We love it.
Definitely.
But I really also appreciate all the questions. They were really good questions.
Yeah, they definitely would. Thank y'all. Well, y'all have a safe trip. I know, I'm gonna stop recording so that we